I'm Rosie, a 30-year-old manager at a nearby business. My spouse, Jake, and I reside in a home that I own. It's a modest yet comfortable place that we call home. I suppose you could say that I'm not one to cause a scene and am a rather modest person. My strength has always been my abundance of patience, or so I used to believe. I get along so well with Jake. He's a wonderful man, helpful and considerate. Since we got married a few years ago, everything has gone very well. All right, with the exception of one minor issue. Robert and Susan, his parents. Don't get me wrong, I recognize the value of family, but what about Jake's parents? They tell a very different tale. They are the kind of folks that speak their minds without considering the impact their words may have on others. They are very forthright. They're not very aware of or considerate of personal space. It all began quite innocently. Susan and Robert would unexpectedly stop by for dinner or breakfast. Since they were relatives, at first I didn't mind. But it became routine very quickly. They would drop by any time they felt like it, and since they had a key to our home, they could enter without warning. I heard someone enter the house one day while I was getting ready for work in the bathroom. I noticed Susan in the kitchen when I peered out. "Good morning, Rosie," she remarked happily. "I thought I'd surprise you with breakfast." I recall thinking, this is getting a bit much, as I forced a smile. Jake, God bless him, made an effort to discuss it with them. One evening he stated, "Mom, Dad, Rosie and I love having you over, but we also need our own space." But things didn't work out. Robert's cheeks flushed and tears filled Susan's eyes. "Are you saying you don't want us in your life?" Susan started crying. "After all we've done for you?" Jake was taken aback. "No, that's not what I meant." The discussion abruptly came to an end. They were so good at playing the victim that Jake had no chance. He was caught between his parents and our life together, and I felt bad for him. From then on, things became worse. They began spending the night in our guest room, and before we knew it, they were staying for days at our apartment instead of just coming for meals. We had visitors staying at our place all the time. I gave it another go with Jake. "I love your parents, honey, but this is getting too much." I hoped he would understand when I said, "They're here all the time." With a groan, he combed through his hair. "Rosie, I am aware. I'll try to speak with them once again." However, I felt in my heart that it was hopeless. He was unable to resist them because they had a way of making him feel bad. Life with Jake's parents coming and going at will began to resemble an endless repeat of the same episode on television. Before I knew it, our guest room felt more like theirs than ours. Breakfast had evolved into lunches, which had transformed into evenings. I was trying to be understanding, but every day it was becoming more difficult. I heard the sound of pots and pans clattering in the kitchen one Saturday morning. Rubbing my eyes, I checked the time and saw that it was almost 6:30 a.m. Half sleepy, I ventured into the kitchen to find Susan happily preparing pancakes. "Rosie, good morning." "I assumed we would have a large family breakfast today," she remarked, failing to notice my look of astonishment. I forced a courteous grin. "Good morning, Susan. That's very kind of you." As I sipped my coffee at the table, I observed her moving around our kitchen as if she owned it. Robert arrived shortly after us carrying a newspaper. "Good morning, Rosie," he asked. "Sleep well?" Without waiting for a response as he became preoccupied in the sports section. Still attempting to wake up, I nodded. A few minutes later, Jake staggered in, looking just as astonished as I was. He rubbed his eyes, asking, "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here so early?" Susan stated, "We wanted to surprise you with breakfast," as she gracefully flipped a pancake. Jake shot me an apologetic look, and I shot back a shrug of resignation. They started to visit more often after that day. The guest room quickly took on the appearance of their second bedroom as they began to leave personal belongings there. I made an effort to discuss it with Jake, but he was facing difficulties. "They're my parents, Rosie, and I know it's a lot. How do I go about doing this?" he would say, appearing truly conflicted. I tried to be understanding as I nodded. "I get it, Jake, but we need our own space, too." I came into Susan reorganizing our living room one evening. "I moved the couch to the other side of the room because I thought this would look better over here," she remarked. I was unable to suppress my annoyance. "Susan, I appreciate your help, but I liked it the way it was." She looked at me, surprised. "Oh, I just thought it needed a change. But okay, I'll put it back." I watched as she reluctantly moved the couch back, feeling a bit guilty for snapping at her. Things came to a head one night when I came home from work, exhausted, only to find a small gathering in our living room. Robert and Susan had invited some friends over without telling us. "Rosie, dear, we thought we'd have a little get-together." "Hope you don't mind," Susan said, handing me a glass of wine. I looked around at the unfamiliar faces in my living room and felt my patience wearing thin. "Actually, Susan, I do mind. Jake and I had plans tonight." The room went silent, and Susan's face fell. "Oh, I didn't realize. We'll wrap this up then." Jake came to my rescue. "Yeah, Mom, we had a quiet evening planned. Maybe check with us next time." They ended the gathering shortly after, but the damage was done. I felt like a stranger in my own home, and it was clear something had to change. I tried talking to Jake again. "This can't go on, Jake. We need to set some boundaries with your parents." He nodded, looking more determined this time. "You're right, Rosie. I'll talk to them. This is our home, and we should feel comfortable in it." The breaking point came when Jake and I planned a short holiday. We needed a break, a chance to recharge and get away from everything, including the constant presence of his parents in our house. I was really looking forward to it. "We'll be gone for a week, just the two of us. It'll be nice," I said to Jake as we packed our bags. He smiled, wrapping his arm around me. "I can't wait. We need this, Rosie." We informed Robert and Susan about our trip, expecting them to understand. "We're going away for a week. Just wanted to let you guys know," Jake told them over dinner. Susan looked surprised. "A whole week? What about the house? Who will look after it?" I exchanged a glance with Jake. "The house will be fine, Susan. It's just a week." We left for our holiday, and for the first few days it was bliss. No unexpected visitors, no rearranged furniture, just peace. But our peace was short-lived. On the third day, we received a call from Jake's work. There was an emergency, and they needed him back. Our relaxing getaway was cut short. We were both disappointed, but understood that these things happen. We arrived home 2 days earlier than planned, expecting to walk into an empty house. But what we found was far from it. The moment we opened the door, we were greeted by the sound of laughter and music. There were people in our living room, people we didn't know. "What the?" Jake muttered, looking as confused as I felt. We walked in further, and that's when we saw them, Robert and Susan, in the midst of a group of strangers, having what looked like a party. "Mom, Dad, what's going on?" Jake asked, his voice a mix of surprise and anger. Susan looked up, her smile fading when she saw us. "Jake? Rosie, you're back early." "Who are these people?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Robert cleared his throat. "Well, we thought since you were away we'd rent the place out to some friends, just for a few days." I felt my jaw drop. "You did what?" Jake looked like he was about to explode. "You rented out our house without even asking us?" Susan wrung her hands. "We thought it would be fine. You were away, and these friends needed a place to stay." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had turned our home into a rental property without our permission. The nerve of it all left me speechless. Jake was fuming. "Everyone out, now," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The strangers gathered their things, murmuring apologies as they left. Robert and Susan stood there looking guilty but also defiant. "We didn't think it would be a problem," Robert said, trying to justify their actions. "A problem? You crossed a line. This is our home, not a hotel," Jake said, his voice shaking with anger. I stood there watching the scene unfold, feeling a mix of anger, disbelief, and disappointment. This was it. This was the moment when I realized things couldn't go on like this. Something had to change, and it had to change now. After the house was cleared, Jake and I sat down with his parents. "This can't happen again. You can't just use our house like this," Jake said, trying to remain calm. Susan started crying. "We didn't mean any harm. We just thought—" "No, Mom, there's no excuse for this," Jake interrupted. "We need our privacy. We need you to respect our home." They apologized, promising it would never happen again, but their apologies felt empty, and their promises even more so. I looked at Jake, and I could tell he felt the same way. Exhausted and at my wits' end, I knew we had to do something. The love I felt for Jake propelled me to find a middle ground, a solution that wouldn't tear our family apart. The constant invasions by his parents were suffocating, and it was time to reclaim our space. "We need a break, Jake, and we need to do something about your parents," I said, the determination clear in my voice. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Jake nodded. "You're right. Let's plan a weekend getaway. But first, let's change the locks. They can't keep walking in like they own the place." Before our much-needed escape, we executed our secret mission. Replacing the locks felt liberating, like we were finally setting boundaries that should have been there all along. With the new locks in place, we packed our bags. Before leaving, I suggested, "Let's turn off our phones. No distractions, no calls, just us." Jake agreed without a second thought, and we left for our weekend retreat, phones off, hoping for a few days of peace. Our weekend was a slice of heaven. We laughed, shared stories, and for a while the chaos of our life seemed a distant memory. But as we prepared to head back, a nagging sense of uncertainty crept in. On our drive home, we finally turned our phones back on. Almost immediately, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered hesitantly. "This is Officer Daniels. Am I speaking with Mrs. Rosie Thompson?" A stern voice inquired. "Yes, this is she," I replied, my heart starting to race. "I'm calling about an incident at your residence. We have detained several individuals who broke the locks and entered your home." My mouth went dry. Broke the locks? Entered our home? "Yes, ma'am. It appears they were trying to gain unauthorized access. We have them at the station." I glanced at Jake, who was listening intently, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. "We'll be home soon, officer. Thank you for letting us know," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. Hanging up, I relayed the information to Jake. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he let out a long, deep breath. "Who would do that and why?" I whispered, a sense of dread washing over me. "We'll find out soon enough," Jake replied, his jaw set firmly. As Jake and I drove home, the weight of uncertainty was heavy in the car. We both knew that whatever awaited us at home was bound to be unpleasant. The thought of strangers breaking into our home was unsettling, but deep down, I had a nagging suspicion about who might be involved. "We should have seen this coming," Jake said, breaking the silence. "Changing the locks was bound to set them off." I nodded, knowing he was referring to his parents. "Let's just deal with it and move forward. We can't let this ruin what we've built." Arriving home, We found a police car parked outside. My heart sank. This was real. Officer Daniels, a tall man with a stern face, greeted us. We caught them trying to break in. They were quite adamant about getting inside, he explained. Who were they? Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. It was your parents, Mr. Thompson, and some of their friends, Officer Daniels replied. Jake's face turned pale. My parents? But why would they? It seems they were unaware of the lock change. When they couldn't get in, they tried to force their way, the officer continued. I could see Jake struggling to process the information. His parents had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Can we see them? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They're still at the station. You can talk to them there if you wish. Jake and I exchanged a look, a silent agreement passing between us. We needed to face this head on. At the station, we found Robert and Susan sitting in a small room, looking both angry and embarrassed. Their friends were there too, looking equally uncomfortable. Mom? Dad, what were you thinking? Jake asked, his disappointment evident. Robert stood up, his expression defiant. We came to check on the house. We always have a key. Why did you change the locks without telling us? It's our house, Dad. You can't just come and go as you please. We've talked about this, Jake replied, trying to keep his calm. Susan started to cry. We just wanted to be close to you. We never thought you'd lock us out. It's not about locking you out. It's about respect and privacy. You can't break into our house because you feel entitled to it, I said, finding my voice. Their friends looked on, awkward and silent, clearly regretting being part of this mess. We're sorry, but we didn't know what else to do, one of them mumbled. Officer Daniels stepped in. We understand it's a family matter, but breaking and entering is a serious offense. We need assurances this won't happen again. Jake looked at his parents, a mix of sadness and resolve in his eyes. This can't happen again, Mom and Dad. You need to understand boundaries. Robert and Susan nodded, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. We left the station with heavy hearts. The drive back home was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. The events of the day had taken a toll, and as we walked back into our home, we knew things would never be the same again. The days following the incident were like walking through a thick fog. Jake and I were trying to make sense of everything while dealing with the aftermath. We had to have several uncomfortable conversations with neighbors, explaining what had happened. It was embarrassing and draining. One evening, as we were sitting in the living room, Jake let out a long sigh. I never thought my parents would go this far, he said, shaking his head. I reached out and held his hand. It's hard, I know, but we'll get through this together. He squeezed my hand in response, and we sat there in silence, each lost in our thoughts. The doorbell rang, breaking the silence. I got up to answer it, finding our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, standing there with a concerned look. Rosie, dear, is everything all right? We saw the police the other day, she said, her voice full of worry. Yes, Mrs. Henderson. It was a family issue, but it's under control now. Thank you for checking in, I replied, offering her a small smile. She nodded, still looking uncertain. Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me. After she left, Jake looked at me. Maybe we should have a small get-together, invite the neighbors, clear the air. What do you think? I thought about it for a moment. That's a good idea. Let's do it this weekend. The preparations kept us busy, and for a brief time, it felt good to focus on something positive. We invited a few neighbors, keeping it small and casual. The day of the get-together arrived, and our guests slowly trickled in. The atmosphere was light, and the conversation flowed. It was a much-needed distraction. During the evening, Mrs. Henderson approached me. You two are such a lovely couple. It's a shame about the trouble with your in-laws. I gave her a reassuring smile. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. We're handling it the best we can. As the evening wound down, Jake and I felt a sense of relief. The event had served its purpose, easing the tension in the neighborhood. The past few weeks had been a roller coaster, but Jake and I knew what needed to be done. Setting boundaries was the only way forward. We sat at the kitchen table, carefully drafting the rules we felt were necessary for our sanity and the health of our relationship. We can't just go on like this, Jake. It's time for a change, I said firmly, pen in hand. He nodded, looking somber. I know, it's just going to be tough. Once we were ready, we invited Jake's parents over to discuss the new rules. The atmosphere was tense as they sat down in our living room. Jake cleared his throat, and I could see his hands were trembling slightly. Mom, Dad, we need to talk about some changes we're making, he said, sounding calm even though he was nervous. His parents gave us a confused and worried look as they glanced at us. We have chosen to establish certain limits on your visits to our home, I said, attempting to sound as collected and unagitated as I could. Jake's father, Robert, arched an eyebrow. What kind of boundaries? Jake inhaled deeply. Before you come over, we need you to call and make an inquiry. No more surprise visits, and the keys are not available to you. Return. We need our own space, I continued, attempting to sound as kind as possible. Jake's mother, Susan, became distressed right away. But we're related. Why are you treating us in this way? Susan, it's all about privacy and respect, I answered. We love you, but we need these boundaries for the sake of our relationship. They responded right away and with strong feelings. Susan burst into tears, and Robert's face flushed with rage. This is completely ridiculous. We are your guardians. How could you behave as though we were strangers? Robert raised his voice in exclamation. With a strained voice, Jake added, We're not trying to hurt you. We just need some rules. Susan cried, We reject these regulations. You seem to no longer want us in your lives. From there, the conversation took a wild turn. We attempted to explain everything to them, but they would not listen. They played the victims and continued to scream, vehemently refusing to follow the regulations. Jake and I looked at each other resignedly, seeing no way to work things out. Perhaps it would be ideal if we separated for a bit, Jake eventually murmured, his voice laden with melancholy. I agreed and nodded, even though the idea hurt my heart. There was a frightening silence in our home after Jake's parents left in tears. Though we knew it was necessary, it was one of the hardest decisions we had ever made. Both of us required room and time for them to comprehend and honor our limits. Jake put his arm around me in our quiet house. I'm sorry it had to come to this. I leaned in to feel his hug. It's all right. We needed to advocate for ourselves. Perhaps in due course they will comprehend. Though I couldn't help but feel guilty and depressed as we sat there, I knew we had made the correct decision. Establishing limits was necessary, even if it meant temporarily removing oneself from the family. Susan and Robert are not in contact with us at this time. We choose to hold off until they acknowledge the wrongness of their conduct, even though you might condemn us for it.